Thank you so much, Massimo, for inviting me, and thank you all for staying until the last session. It's always very appreciated. Let me just put this out of the way. Sorry. So here we go. So as we are talking today, as we are debating, there are in the southern border of the United States, there are bulldozers taking down forests and piercing through a river, and construction crews are finishing building a wall in the town of Donna, Texas. You probably don't see this in the news here all the time, but the wall goes hand in hand with a very sharp and nasty immigration crackdown in the United States, a policy of terrorizing migrants with the help of the governments of Mexico and Guatemala. So everybody thought it was a joke when Trump said that he would build a wall and the Mexicans would pay for it, but it actually turned out to be true. The wall sends a message to those who want to cross. It says loudly, "We don't want you to come in." But it also shouts to the interior of the United States. It shouts, "We want them out." And because the wall sends an anti-immigrant message, many assume that the populist challenge that the wall symbolizes is the challenge of xenophobic nationalism. So Trumpian right-wing populism, as well as the wall and its xenophobic message, seem to go together. So it also seems that Trump's rise cost the wall. It seemed like populism cost the wall. Well, today I'm making the point that this is deceptive. The rise of right-wing populism in the United States did not cost the wall. Right-wing populism in the US is a new phenomenon, but xenophobic nationalism is not. So the wall and this nationalism are not caused by Trump's movement. My point today is that to understand the connection between the new populist challenge and the wall and borders in general, we have to look elsewhere. But the border wall can still help us to give an answer. What seems to have changed recently is not xenophobia, which is a staple of the United States politics and ideology, but the federal government's attitude towards that staple. So before Trump, the United States government talked about fences, as in the saying, good fences make good neighbors. It evoked, nice white picket fences. But in contrast, the populist message is that borders are walls, that they are there to exclude. So Trump's wall is a symbol of populism's willingness to openly accept that the border excludes, that the United States seeks to keep immigrants out, and that the government is proud to uphold that policy. My point, moreover, is that the wall's message is not directed at migrants, particularly those migrants without papers who were well aware that that was the policy. And it's not directed at xenophobes. They always knew what they wanted. Rather, the message is directed to liberal Democrats who compose the mainstream of United States politics. The wall is meant to speak to them another truth, that they don't know how to reconcile borders with the official commitment to universal inclusion. Populism demands that the liberal democratic state acknowledge the internal connection between contemporary states and their exclusionary national identity. This new political sincerity that I'm going to be talking about is not a superficial matter, and it's not only about walls. So liberals are ashamed, as well they should be, of the exclusionary lines they draw, because they don't know how to justify them. And they know that they are arbitrary. And they contradict the universalist message that they claim to uphold. And that is the populist challenge that is symbolized by the wall. Moreover, this is the challenge of right-wing populism, but also of left-wing populism. Populism in general denounces liberalism's unwillingness to draw borders. But I argue that the reason that this matters is that the three positions that I've just listed, right-wing, left-wing populism, and liberalism, see contemporary politics as a matter of the boundaries of identity. But I will argue, I will let you know later on, that these are not the only possibilities. I suggest that this is not a good way to deal with the most important problems that are facing us today, including, of course, immigration and the current climate crisis. And, of course, these two are linked, and we need alternatives to face them. I will talk about this at the end. And I think that the wall shows how all of these problems are coming together. So before I go to left populism and the ecological crisis, let me come back to Trump, okay? So here he is. As you may know, the wall was Trump's main campaign promise, and this is how he rallies crowds. Build the wall. So this is how he gets all the people in red hats incensed. Steering nationalism, xenophobia, and racial animus is how he feels happiest. This drives Democrats, as in US Democratic Party Democrats, and Trump's opponent in general crazy, of course, maybe because they say and they repeat that walls don't work, or that they're not doing what he says that they're doing. So this is a meme, not a real picture, of course. But there are similar pictures of people climbing all over the internet, and of course, periodically the police finds tunnels with tracks, electricity, and electronic surveillance systems that transport contraband and people, and also borders can be crossed with drones, all sorts of things. So Democrats often say that walls don't work, but I disagree. They do work, of course. They are part of a complex strategy both of power grabbing by the executive in the United States, and in many other places, they're also part of a strategy of militarization of the civilian realm. So this includes patrolling and policing. It includes building strategic fortifications, not only at the border, but also in the interior. It also involves governing and sharing and processing and data, obtaining and processing data with other countries. And finally, it includes a strategy of using the walls to funnel flows of migrants to particularly dangerous routes. And all of this together can, in fact, reroute or stop immigration altogether. In this grand scheme, the wall, as an object, is, of course, superfluous to the specific purpose of keeping migrants out. But it does work. As Wendy Brown and Peter Andreas have argued from their very different perspectives, the wall works because it has a symbolic role. But this is real political work. A borders wall, real work, is to send a message that the government is serious about stopping migrants. The populist challenge concerns who receives the message and how. Yet the message tells me, a Mexican migrant, and also Trump supporters who see themselves as the real American people, that we, migrants, foreigners, Mexicans, Central Americans, Arabs, are a group. And when the chants at the rally rise, we become an outgroup, which helps the Make America Great Again people in the red caps affirm their own identity. So the images of the wall, like the chant, help to define the identity group to which the chanters belong, and to create a group of outsiders to which they are opposed. So the wall symbolizes the state protecting the limits of the people defined against the migrants. So by extension, it sends the message that the country belongs to the people, its rightful owners, and it rejects those who do not belong to the people, but are physically present in the territory. Although I, the immigrant, and the xenophobes, are the Trump supporters, hear the message, the wall's message is not aimed at us for two reasons. First, because long before the populists rose to power, the walls were already there, sending their exclusionary message. So where were we? Yes, there. So the wall has been there for a long time. The United States government has been hardening borders for a century before Donald Trump came to power. The US border fence became law in 2006 through the Secure Fence Act, but ever since the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, which ended the Mexican-American War and where Mexican country lost half of its territory, there has been a steady increase of infrastructure and policing along the US-Mexico border. So the first time that there was a wall built was a little bit after this picture was taken, and that is 1915, and it's in the town of Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Mexico. The infrastructure and the buildup became obvious in the 1980s, and the hardening of the border became a clear symbolic message after 9/11. So all of this preceded Trump's populism or any other such electoral movement. And this is also obviously true about the xenophobia. The xenophobia and racism, of course, have been endemic to actually existing liberal states such as the United States long before populism became a considerable political force. So racism and xenophobia preceded the new populist challenge, and they're hardly exclusive to it. But there's another reason why populism cannot be the cause of the wall. And that is that there are other forms of populism that do not seek to exclude migrants necessarily. So this is, that's Trump. This is a left-wing populism. This is Evita, in case you didn't recognize her, just in case. So there is a left-wing populism that also challenges liberal democratic institutions, but that is not racist and does not isolate immigrants so as to define its own identity. So those populists hate walls and welcome migrants. And like right-wing populism, they build a common identity by excluding an enemy as not part of the genuine people. But for left-wing populism, the enemy is the rich or the corrupt elites or the 1% of the oligarchy. Populism, then, is not intrinsically xenophobic. But if the rise of the populist, whether left or right, is not the wall's direct cause, and if walls don't go hand in hand with populism because the connection between the populist message and the border wall is not racism, xenophobia, then we need to look somewhere else for that connection. My point is that the populist challenge that the wall symbolizes is to call liberalism's bluff. Liberalism claims that it can include everyone, but in fact, it cannot. Liberal Democrats draw exclusionary borders because they must, but they do not know how to account for them. So by openly accepting these exclusions, populists shame liberals and expose their weakness. What is new and characteristic of border walls today, in the new era of populism gaining power worldwide, is the clarity and the ease with which the new populist governments use the walls to symbolize the limit of exclusion from the citizenry. So, for example, the US government used to display in the page of the custom patrols, they used to talk about fences, and they used all sorts of euphemisms to refer to the world. They talked about they're there for security, they're there for health, they're there for the environment. They almost didn't even mention migrants. But now they're completely blunt. They absolutely don't care. In fact, it's completely reversed. It used to be that they had a wall, and they used to call that wall a fence because fences are less offensive. Now it's exactly the opposite. They are building fences because they can see through them, and so they're more effective, but they call them walls, which is, if you watch them, I'm not going to play the movie, but if you watch it, you will see, I mean, there's the lady referring to it and says, the wall. It's like, isn't that a fence? Anyway, so populists are not ashamed of excluding those individuals whom they don't consider part of the people. And this exclusionary message is not mainly aimed at regular or irregular immigrants that, as I said before, they already knew that they were unwelcome, And it's not aimed at the nationalist base of the Republican Party. It is aimed to the liberals to force them to accept that despite their pretense of magnanimity and inclusiveness, they also exclude, often harshly. So the wall's message is meant only to point out liberal hypocrisy, not only, but it helps a lot, or to highlight the blindness of those liberal Democrats who don't see contradictions in their ideology or their discourse. The point is to show that the liberal democratic promise of diversity without exclusion, it's an unfounded promise, it's a bluff. So Americans love metaphors of sports and cards. And so they often make it into everyday speech. If you speak English, you're probably using baseball metaphors you haven't noticed. So one of the ones that I like are the cards metaphors. So let me talk a little bit more about that. If you haven't heard of Texas Hold'em, that's why I'm going to talk a little bit more about the bluff. So a political example. In December and January last year, in 2018, 2019, the US government shut down for a whole month. I know that doesn't make a lot of sense. What does that mean that the US government shut down? Well, it actually, when you have the executive and the legislative not agreeing on the budget, the things stop. So only the emergency services work, but government workers stop receiving their money. So the government shut down for 35 days. And what was going on, it was something similar what happens when you have two people playing cards and you want to see who's going to blink, who's going to actually break down. And so they had their cards and they were both bluffing. For more than a month, there was this showdown between the legislature and the executive. Nancy Pelosi, a liberal Democrat, and Donald Trump, a populist Republican, were staring at each other. They wanted to see who would blink first. And at stake was mainly the wall, but of course the stakes were even higher. There was a confrontation over which political force would determine the country's direction. So of course in the budget, the reason why the Democrats did not want to pass it is because there were $6 billion, including for wall building. So a showdown in poker, it's a situation in which more than one player remains after the last betting round. The remaining players show their cards and let the cards do the talking. So they all compare their hands to determine the winner. In the government shutdown, it was a political showdown between the Republican White House and the Democratic House of Representatives. And in the end, actually, it was Trump who blinked because he couldn't keep the government closed for much longer. But actually, it was the president who lost the hand, may have won something much bigger. He forced those on the other side to show their cards. And when it comes to the border walls, they showed that they were bluffing. If a poker bluff is to raise the bet with a bad hand, congressional Democrats made the metaphorical equivalent of that bet. They claimed to oppose the exclusion that the wall represents, like most traditional liberal Democrats, and particularly those who cherish multiculturalism. They denied that they would exclude anyone without a good reason. They claimed that they were open to all immigrants and to all refugees. They wanted to promote diversity and keep a liberal democratic country running on multiculturalism. They claimed to offer the privileges of social democracy to all, and to do so without undermining the country's institutions. They bet, in short, that they could have it all. Yet their hand was much more modest, because no state, not even a liberal democratic state, has unlimited territory. And of course, it does not have unlimited territorial jurisdiction. They must also exclude, and they often exclude without any good reason. So, for example, a very good, I think this is the best example of what is going on, is what Americans call the dreamers. Those who are committed to the values of equality for all hate border walls because they cannot accept the discrimination on the basis of identity. Given that identity, particularly ethnic and racial identity, is something that you don't choose, liberals consider it morally irrelevant. This, for example, is why liberal Democrats agree that the children of immigrants who were brought illegally to the country are not responsible for their identity or their immigration status. So during the Obama years, there was a program called DACA, or Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. So not deporting these migrants and letting them stay in the country is the right thing to do, according to most people, because although they recognize that these youths are illegal migrants, they also recognize that they are not morally responsible for their immigration status. So we should not use that status as a ground to discriminate against them or to undermine their life opportunities. And they should not be punished with deportation for a crime they did not commit. They were children, after all. So identity should be morally irrelevant to the immigrant's dignity, and it is against liberal principles to exclude people on morally arbitrary grounds. And yet, to uphold democracy and the welfare state, liberal states, including the United States, habitually exclude people from the polity on just such arbitrary grounds. Unless we had a world state, some people who want to be citizens will not be included. And this, of course, creates a sense of injustice. This sense of injustice unsettles the liberal expectation of having a plural, inclusive, and diverse demos. We liberals, and I'm calling myself liberal because I share those principles, we want a demos that incorporates multiple nations, cultures, religions, races, ethnicities. But then how do we manage to exclude without injustice? I could go into detail, but the truth of the matter is that both political philosophers and everyone else who has thought critically about these issues, about particularly the history and the politics of borders, agree that the construction of national identity, the construction of civic identity, and the positioning of geographical borders is arbitrary from a liberal democratic perspective. So you can make a nationalist argument for why the borders of states are where they are. But you cannot make a liberal democratic argument for why the borders are where they are. Territorial borders, which are the ground of modern states, are arbitrary, and they're incompatible with the inclusionary languages of liberal democracy. They claim to offer the privilege, I'm sorry, I read the same page. So arbitrary exclusions of borders undermine the legitimacy of those who don't want to ground belonging on national bonds or arbitrary civic limits. Of course, this is a very American-centered talk, as you can see, but this is not exclusive of the United States. You've seen this picture before. This is the border in Hungary. You know this story very well. And this is Ceuta, I believe, or Melilla. I hope I'm not making... No, I think it's Ceuta. In any case, it is the border between Europe and Africa. This is the external limit of Schengen. So that is what I think is the contradiction. That's the bluff. Liberal democracy excludes on the basis of morally arbitrary criteria. It excludes those who are not already members of the civic community. And it also excludes on the basis of national origin. It excludes also on the basis of territorial presence, which seems very meaningful, but actually, think about it. Universal inclusion is a bluff, because the cards of liberal democracy are no better than those of the populist. Of course, I'm not endorsing the cruelty with which immigrants have been kicked out from the United States or this country. I am a Mexican immigrant in the United States. I do think there are differences in the way we treat the institutions of liberalism, but in principle, they all share the same problem. So what is special and distinctive about the new populism is that it seeks to openly denounce the internal inconsistencies of liberal democracy. Liberal democracy excludes on the basis of morally arbitrary criteria. Left and right populism meet when they denounce this hypocrisy. Now, the populist challenge to liberalism is real. It pushes liberal democracy into a corner. It also defines the current political landscape as a triangle of positions that negate one another. So first, You have liberal democracy seeking to defend universalism while excluding, and so contradicting itself. Then you have right populism, which is consistently being exclusivist, but it is unacceptable to what I consider the right way of conceiving democracy. And third, left populism, which is clear-eyed about liberal exclusions and the injustices of right populism, but because it's so anchored in the territorial national state and in an idea of not necessarily of class distinctions, but this idea of the top and the bottom, it's unable to constitute an inclusive democratic alternative to the other two, as I will explain now. So left and right-wing populism denounce liberal contradictions. You get like these alliances. Oh, I don't know what happened with my M. Anyway, that you have these triangular alliances where the right populism and liberalism align against left populism and right-wing populism against liberalism, and liberalism and right populism against left populism on different axes. So both right and left populism are committed to understanding politics in terms of exclusionary boundaries that are not arbitrary. So they seek to construct the people of democratic politics by exclusion. They see this as the ground of politics. Those who understand populism as chiefly an ideology agree that it is core doctrine, that society is divided into two groups. I guess I'm calling it ideology, but I accept that it could be a logic, like Lau called it. And so the people, and those who don't belong to it, there we go. That's why I don't like it when you print it on both sides, although I don't like printing too much. The wall symbolizes the populist challenge to liberal democracy because it stands for the limit of the people. So it is a category meant to construct political identities, like the kind of identity of the Indian and the Pakistani here at the border ceremony in Wagah in Kashmir. But see, the border is not only a symbol, it's also the physical limit of the state. It is the edge of a territorial jurisdiction. So this is where I want to go. I think that the problem here is that we are thinking of politics only in terms of political identities. So left populism often presents its view as the only alternative to the politics of the wall. It rejects the hypocrisy of liberalism and also the right's xenophobic exclusions. For left populism, politics inevitably excludes some persons in the political order from membership in the people. So the best we can do is to prevent a turn to xenophobia or virulent racist politics by choosing another line of exclusion. We should, argue left populists, exclude those who both deserve it and who can have the resources to deal with being excluded. These people are the current political elites, or the idea of the current political elites, who they say now exclude the non-elites. In the case of the xenophobia that the border wall highlights, left populists seek to exclude the excluder. That is, they seek to fight fire with fire, in a way. Left populism and liberal democracy both reject the racial and ethnic exclusion of the populist right. However, left populists contend that the only way to combat xenophobia and the politics of the wall is to create different walls or symbolic equivalents to them in other places in society. Right-wingers and liberals agree, but on the other axis. They claim that they don't discriminate arbitrarily. They think that the left does not make sense when they say that their line of exclusion is more just, because they think that being a political elite and saying that they exclude the elites makes no sense. And the people of the left has to be constructed by somebody, and these tend to be the political elites. So, for example, where Bernie Sanders say that he speaks for the people, the liberals on the right are eager to point out that the contradiction of being a senator from a highly educated background, the white man from the political elite, and then say that he doesn't discriminate arbitrarily. And this is obviously perceived in a particular way by the people, by particularly black people, and particularly in the South. So excluding the elite does not make sense in a country where the people are supposed to be everyone, the demos, a democracy. So a horizontal division does not make sense either. So as I was saying, the vertices of the triangle negate each other, and they seem to contradict. So they send us into a vicious spiral. What I would say it's a trilemma. However, I don't think that we are not doomed to eternal circulation among these vertices. And this is what I really want to propose. The real beauty of pluralism is that there are always many options. So the wall symbolizes this, what I said before. It shows one way of making politics on the basis of identity. So here, again, the identity of the Indian and the Pakistani. But remember, the border, it's the physical limit of the state, is the edge of the territorial jurisdiction. So just put the metaphor aside for a moment. The walls are also part of a territory and the land where people live. Wagah and Atari, which are these towns next to each other, are actually the same place. The guards are physically in the same place. Physical borders are concrete places in the borderlands, but they also demarcate where people organize their life in common. The physical wall is a reminder that the border symbolically separates, but it's also physically in the middle of places that cannot be detached from one another. So the physical wall can show us a way out of the trilemma. Again, the physical border is a reminder that places are interconnected. They show us an alternative approach to constitute political communities. So if identity answers to the question, who are you? We could also deal by asking the question, where are you? These two overlap, like the many possible answers to the question, who are you? So this is the physical border between Mexico and the United States. It's obviously the same place. And the circles of identity cross-cut and overlap in similar ways. They're connected and they overlap. If we drop the metaphor of the wall as a symbol of exclusion and division between two groups, only two, us and them, we can concentrate on the geographic limits of territory and see how individuals organize themselves in given places without following identity lines. If we see past the symbols, we can notice that political groups are mostly defined by places rather than identities. All sorts of people live in a political jurisdiction, and they don't have to identify with each other, even in terms of a civic people. So thinking in terms of the symbolic wall makes us think that countries are independent from one another. But thinking in terms of the geographic limits of territory reminds us that although the world is divided by juridical lines, countries are physically connected. Countries stand on the same mountains, as I pointed out before. They share the same geographical structures. They share subterranean water, air currents, biota, including people. They share plants and animals and people. So thinking in terms of the wall makes us think that borders are mainly a way to attain an ideal of political exclusion and inclusion. But thinking in terms of the geographic limits of territory is a reminder we cannot conflate the borders with the limits of membership in any given group. I am a member of the Mexican nation, so I'm part of that circle. Even when I'm in the United States, or when I'm in Estonia. But when I am in the US, and when I am in Estonia, I am part of another group. I'm part of this group. The limits set by the triangle of exclusivist ideologies, liberalism, right populism, left populism, appears impassable from this angle. So traditional you, us, and them, if you think in those terms, you're saying, hey, you're not part of us. What do you mean? Like, you just came in here yesterday. What do you mean you're like a part of us, of Estonia? But yeah, I'm saying that. If you look at the borders in terms of geographical limits, you can see that many combinations are possible. There's a model of many separate groups within a territory, federations, confederation, multinational states, political arrangements of all sorts of identity groups are there. But there's also place-based models, neighborhood associations, townships, place-based communes that bring people together from different identity groups in one particular place. So I just put all of those groups together and they look like something like that. You don't need to have an external border. Thinking in terms of the wall obscures plurality. Thinking in terms of geographical limits of territory highlights the cross-cutting circles, as well as the importance of ecology and the politics of the coming environmental crisis, which will force us to conform physical reality beyond symbols and metaphors. So a flood does not discriminate between nationals and foreigners, between authorized or irregular migrants. If there was a fire in the building now, it would not discriminate between Estonians and Mexicans, or French or Italian, just in case. So, although current ideologies would love to emphasize the difference, these become less relevant when place-specific obligations arise. Thinking in terms of the wall is a way to postpone the inevitable. Thinking in terms of geographic limits of territory allows to be clear-eyed about the future. And I'm not saying that there's only one political solution. There are very many political solutions. There can be a green populism that closes borders and has a new blood and soil way of approaching climate migrants. But there are other ways of organizing it. If the forecasts are on track, the climate crisis will connect us all in visible ways through flows of physical forces such as water and air that are, of course, already real. So one way to imagine these lines is in terms of place-based communities. The wall is a populist response to liberal blindness to its own limitations. So a non-populist response to the wall involves acknowledging the inevitability of exclusion, but also reframing the boundaries from which we exclude. There is not only one way of building those borders. This means that focusing on the local communities, not in terms of identity, but in terms of presence, place, and ecology, can help us break through the symbolic triangle and the physical wall. If we make politics not in terms of identity groupings and not asking who you are, but we think about groups constructed by environmental necessity, asking where you are. So, you are here now with us. Thank you.